Today, the BBC's top brass faced questions from peers on the future of the licence fee. The Director General, Tim Davie, was last quizzed on the funding conundrum in October last year. But there's been 9 months of deliberation on the corporation's future. That did appear to be pretty fruitless. Why? Well, here's how the Director General responded when he was asked for an update on the BBC's funding options since that meeting last year.
While there are challenges on the licence fee, our income's only down 1.6%, and actually competitively, the BBC's had a really good year. But you cannot break the funding mechanic from the editorial vision of an organisation. Advertising leads you in a completely different direction, and subscription leads you in a completely different direction.
A government source also today told The Times that the licence fee model is unsustainable. They said figures show unwillingness to pay the fee, and that grows year by year. Well, I'm joined now by the former BBC chief political correspondent John Sargent and the columnist for The Sun and The Sunday Times, Rod Liddle. A very good evening to you both. Both of you obviously worked at the corporation before. We just heard from Tim Davie making it clear, I think, that in his mind, the licence fee is the future. John, if we start with you, how do you see an organisation that I know you cherish and that you trust, how do you see it is sustainable in terms of how it gets funded in the future?
Well, I think what they've got to look for, and I think that Tim Davie is aware of this, that you can't simply go on increasing the licence fee year after year. It is becoming very difficult to argue in favour of that. But what you can do is look for other ways of helping people who find it difficult to pay the licence fee. So I suspect that's one area they'll be looking at more and more intensely. What came over this afternoon from the long hearing was that the BBC were going to delve into every possibility. They were going to welcome the review the government are expected to announce in the autumn. And this long battle for the future of the BBC is now very much ignited. And it'll go on for several years before the new charter has to come into effect, which is in 5 years' time.
And in the meantime, what happens to the content they could produce if they don't get the same level of funding? Rob, from your perspective, the sort of answer we just had laid out there from John is keep the licence fee, but find other ways of adding up to the funding so that doesn't land on people and their household bills. Does that work, no, the licence fee, but topped up?
No, I think it's. I think, with respect to John, who I love very much indeed, it's evading the issue, which is if you look at the people who are paying the licence fee, it was down 700,000 in 2021. It was down another 300,000 in 2022. We've now heard that it's down another 500,000. You add that up to the 1.2 million listeners. I'm surprised it's not more, given that I'm a regular listener and have recently switched off. The 1.2 million reduction in Radio 4. You look at audience. Then you look at, what's happened to programmes like Newsnight, down from round about 1 million at the turn of the century to round about 290,000 now. If we don't act now, if Tim Davie, if the BBC doesn't act now, this continual chipping away and eroding, most of which is simply the consequence of a change in the market, of the streaming services, of people being given more choice, some of which has been exacerbated beyond all doubt, certainly on Radio 4 and probably on BBC One, by the kind of social justice warrior agenda that these overgrown arts academics who work for the corporation persist in foisting upon an audience which doesn't want them. If that continues, there won't be much left of the BBC. What the BBC needs to do now is, and Tim Davie's right in some respects, and I know John would be right about this, that actually if you look at the BBC as a subscription service, it would be very, very competitive and very attractive. That's now, with the licence fee, 160 quid or whatever, and compared to Sky, which is much, much more, or Netflix, which is quite a bit more, it would be an attractive proposition. You leave this another 10 years, and it won't be an attractive proposition because there'll be so few people watching the BBC, and that is the problem.
Would that help solve what you're talking about, is some of the editorial issues that you think are the reason that people are saying they don't want to pay?
Yeah, I think the partisan reasons, the political bias reasons, exacerbate the issue. I don't think they're the main issue. The main issue is the change in the market. We've all known this. John Burt knew it back in the 1990s. He could see this coming. Well, we all knew that this would happen. The BBC has, because it's excluded from the commercial sphere, Radio 4 is allowed to continue dropping down the ratings with an agenda which its audience simply do not like, because it doesn't have a commercial competitor insofar as they see it. But no, I think reluctantly, and I say it reluctantly because I believe that the country should come together. I believe in the nationalisation of the utilities. I believe in the idea of a state broadcaster, but it's now too far gone for it to exist in such a way. And what we're doing is clinging on to something which we used to love because we used to love it, not because it still serves the purpose we want it to.
John, do you think that's fair? Is it still much loved and trusted?
I think Rod is being very pessimistic. There are some ways in which why do the BBC have so many critics? One reason is because the people care about the BBC. Why do so many people care about it? Because they pay for it themselves. They individually pay for it. Now, if you have another system whereby only the rich pay for it, inevitably the content of the BBC may change. There's a danger that they will only look to the people who paid for them, the piper playing the tunes. So that's the great danger of moving too far away from a licensed system where everyone is involved. And that's what was discussed in great detail this afternoon.
John, do you recognise any of the editorial concerns that Rod's laid out?
No, I think there'll always be editorial concerns, particularly but from the media who are competing against the BBC. The BBC has an extraordinarily difficult role to play, much more difficult now with social media, apart from anything else, because people on the BBC who are sports presenters and other things start giving their views on social media, and people say, there you are. You see, it just shows they're biased. The concept of impartiality is something that people find very difficult to follow. But if you don't try and pursue the truth with as much vigor as you can, God knows where we will be. I mean, what the truth is that people find an impartial account of what's happened more interesting than a partial, distorted account. So Ron shouldn't be so pessimistic. There's a long-term future for the BBC, but they do have to find a different funding structure.
And Rod, we have seen it. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I mean, I agree with John to a point, although I don't think that Gary Lineker matters one bit. I just don't think he matters a bit. What matters is what Tim Davie, the Director General, identified as a leftish bias within the BBC. I mean, John is absolutely right. People want unpartisan news. And that is something which is very difficult to do through all the complex issues of story selection and so on. But it's nonetheless what the BBC has more or less been able to do, even though it's been at war with the government since, as John will know as well, since the 1920s. It really was at war back then with Conservative and Labour governments. But now it is, as Tim Davie points out, the bias in comedian programmes, comedy programmes, is just so far to the left. You listen to Radio 4 for 4 or 5 hours, and there are still some good things on it. Things like sliced bread, things like the science stuff, but an awful lot of it is putting people off. It's relentless obsession with race and gender issues and wokeism. And all that stuff does exacerbate the real problem. And the real problem, I'm afraid, John, is the fact that down 700,000, 300,000, 500,000, that is only likely to continue simply because of the market and the way things are at the moment.
We're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much. Rod and John, two very different perspectives put there. John saying, look, let's have a subscription model that's kind of topped up. Rod saying, sorry, a licence fee that's topped up. And Rod saying, no, maybe it's time for a subscription service. Thank you both very much.